Hello, Yuri, and welcome to session two, where we're looking at the monkey's paw, part one questions, and then I will read part two and three. So, the first thing after the end of part one was to explain how the monkey's paw fit with the features of Gothic genre we have listed here. So it looks like you had really good ideas. So the supernatural. So we have the idea of something being cursed and granting wishes, and the paw squirming and writhing when it was held when the wishes were cast. And the idea we talked about India being this exotic location where magical things can happen. So the isolated setting, it talks about how the old man, Mr. White, is moaning about how he doesn't know anything about what's happening in town anymore because of how far out their house is, and there's not very many houses around. There's only two others, so it's sort of setting up the scene to have be isolated. It's not in a very densely populated area, and then darkness, so it's happening at night, and so old abandoned buildings. Well, it's the same idea as the isolated setting, isn't it? And the treacherous weather, so yes, it's raining and bad weather, and then it's frightening or mysterious characters. So we have Sergeant Major, so this mysterious character that comes in, this friend um, who has been to this exotic, mysterious location, and he's got this magical item, and obviously he talks about this old Kafir um, wise man, spiritual character that talks about the monkey's paw and its purpose. So well done for getting those responses. And then, what is the atmosphere like in the White family home at the beginning of the story? Then give it a quotation. So the atmosphere at the beginning, we've got a fire burning brightly. The blinds were drawn. Um, a white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. So cold and horrible outside, but it's nice and warm and cozy inside, so it's very relaxed. Father and son playing chess. So it's a very homely, warm family scene. Very nice, cozy, warm atmosphere at the beginning. And then, what do we learn about Sergeant Major Morris? And then, how did you feel when he entered the story? So we have this horrible weather outside. The roads are torrent, the pathways are bog, and that sort of ties in with the isolated setting, isn't it, as well? So they're expecting this person, and then comes in with a bit of a noise, a bit of expectation. So the gate bangs loudly, and there's heavy footsteps. So this stranger coming in from the storm. So that's quite a good device. Someone coming in is symbolically gonna bring negativity with them, or change, or even adventure. So we have a tall, burly man, beady of eye, and rubicund. So red, red-faced, and I think he drinks quite a lot, doesn't he? And that sort of explains that. So tall, burly man, so he's strong. So beady of eye, so he's got piercing gaze when he looks, uh, and then he's got a rosy red face. Okay, so that's how he comes in, and he brings a bit of excitement and interest. So the writer gives the reader hints that the monkey's paw is dangerous. So finds two examples and explain how those examples hint at the danger. So that's a bit later on. So here we have Mr. White's reminding Sergeant Major Morris that the story he started saying earlier and he didn't finish it. And then here we have nothing, said the soldier hastily, leastwise nothing worth hearing. So that's setting up this idea of he doesn't want to speak. There's got to be a reason he doesn't want to speak about the monkey's paw. So that's a bit of intrigue and danger. And then what you might call magic, perhaps. So magic, uncontrolled, dangerous. So the visitor is thinking, so he starts to drink an empty glass, so that shows you he's thinking, worried, or absent-mindedly. Drinking from an empty glass because he's thinking about the danger or the intrigue or the story, what's happened to him. And then the idea about having a spell put on it by an old fakir in India. So these ideas show some danger. So the idea of magic and spells are often those things associated with witchcraft and devilry and things like that. So that's, and the way the characters react to it being talked about and the reluctance to have it talked about. Then we've got the contrast inside and outside. So we talked about that earlier. So the storm and the weather, the warm, cozy, bright warmth of the inside. And then why do you think the characters feel unsettled at the end of part one? So they start talking and making jokes. So the young man, the son Herbert, making jokes about something monkey Simeon, you know, the creature that owned the poor before coming and haunting them. Um, so the atmosphere with the fire, it says unusual and depressing, a silence unusual and depressing settled upon them. So that's with the fine crash from the piano. Because the object was thrown after he made the wish, twisted in his hand like a snake. So something has happened, they're very uneasy. There's a tension, isn't there, because they've made a wish and it's been set up that we're worried about what the wish, uh, how the wish is going to come true. How are they going to get their £200? So it's number 7, isn't it, that said about predicting what will happen next. So, and then this quote, number 6, so he wanted to show the old fakir who put the holy man, put the curse, the spell on the monkey's paw. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. So what does this mean? So this means that fate, so a force, rules people's lives. So what happens to us, we don't have control of it. So obviously we have control of our actions and choices, but if you try and go against the natural order of things in your life, so if you try and interfere, things like magic, things that aren't natural, then sorrow will happen. So what happens to us is meant to be. So if we're rich, we're rich, we're poor, we can work for it and try and change those things. But if you try and do it, if you try and interfere, then there'll be sorrow. So with that warning, what do you think is going to happen next in the story? So we've got 4 characters, 3 family, and the Sergeant Major. So the young man making jokes about monsters on the cupboard, things like that. So let's read and see what actually happens to the story. So well done if you answered those as well as you could. So part 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shrivelled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense! How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert, as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it will turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind it, hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Moore and Meggins." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. "There, there, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down, and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir," and he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God!" said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that! Thank—" She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid a trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length, in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the door. "The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without looking round. "I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. "I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services they wish to present you with a certain sum in compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hands, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly. put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. So that's the end of part 2. So story, Herbert the son has gone off to work, and his parents are waiting for him, and a man is outside, and he comes in towards the end of the day and awkwardly explains that Herbert has had an accident at work in the machinery in the factory and is dead, and the company want to pay the sum of £200, the sum that Mr. White wished for the day before. So that cheating, trying to get money for nothing, seems to be the issue here, doesn't it? You got your £200, but not how you'd want it. So remember, there's one wish left. What do you think that wish may be used on from the monkey's paw? So part 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it?" "It's in the parlour on the bracket," he replied, marvelling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly, and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy!" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Go back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried the old woman, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see, then how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness, and felt his way to the parlour, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burnt below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but both lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, the husband took the box of matches, and striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing, and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back, and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the ball. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in! A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came back slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw, and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a loud, long wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickered opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. So the two wishes that they had. So the first wish they used to bring their son back to life, and then the third wish just before their mutilated 10-day-old son, 10-day dead son returned. The father used the third and final wish. So that wish to just as the mother was going to let him in, the timing there, that tension. It's a very cleverly done story, isn't it? So the wish for his son to be dead. So from your predictions, when you were thinking about what will happen next in the story, did you think that Herbert the son, something would happen to him? Lots of you thought that bad things were going to happen and they would pay the price of making the wish. But I wonder how many of you thought it would be as gruesome and unkind an idea as this one. So that's the Gothic genre. This is a very good example of a Gothic story where it's quite psychological and dark and sinister, and the setting, and a lot of it is psychological. So it's nothing really gruesome. The son doesn't come in and torture and murder anyone. But we've got the idea of the son being unrecognizable from his injuries, limping down a road, but it's all that stuff is in our imaginations, and that's why I like this story, and I hope you did too. So well done for showing me your work on this, and thank you very much.